Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to the last session of Rethinking Economics for this year. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being a part of this journey till now. So, today we have as our guest Dr. Rohit Azad from CSP JNU. And today's session is an Ask Me Anything session. I'll just run through the format briefly. The first 30 minutes is going to be a conversation, and the last 30 minutes is open to the audience for a Q&A session. So, introducing Dr. Rohit. Dr. Rohit is an assistant professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has written the book It's Not Over: Structural Drivers of the Global Economic Crisis, and has also recently co-edited a book with Dr. Deepa Sinha, A Quantum Leap in the Wrong Direction, a Political Economy of the Modi Government. He has been a Fulbright scholar at the New School University and the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Trisha. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. All of you, Karan and Rethinking Economics India. In general, Rethinking Economics is something that I've followed extensively. To have an India chapter is even more exciting.
Thank you so much. We would like to now move to our first question. So, Professor Rohit, why do you think there is a need for pluralism in macroeconomics, and how do you think we integrate these ideas within the curriculum?
So, if I can answer this question in two parts, first is the question of why, and then comes the question of how. Why pluralism? On that, I would say, think of any policy, whether it's monetary policy, whether it's fiscal policy, labor market, any policy is actually ultimately made by people. Economists or policy makers. And they're all trained in economics, formally trained in economics, except the RBI governor currently. But mostly people are trained in economics from different institutions. And as has been the case, fortunately or unfortunately, most of them are trained in the Anglo-Saxon tradition and the mainstream departments from where they come. Now, if you're trained in a particular way, it is obvious that the policy that follows from the training that you've got would also be in that. And as you would see when we discuss this in a little more detail, that affects your you have a blinkered vision because that's the only way you've been taught or you've been, or your research has been. So that's one. The second thing is economics, unfortunately, this was not the case earlier, but economics, unfortunately, has become, or at least there is an attempt to make it into an exact science, or exact sciences as, mathematics, physics, where, the answers are supposed to be objective in nature. Whereas, in economics, which is actually a social science, you may have multiple answers and not one answer may be correct. You can have multiple answers which would throw light on the same problem in different ways. After all, you're looking at human behavior. How can you expect the human behavior to be of a particular kind, which is driven by natural laws? In fact, even in natural sciences, the questions that you pose, it may seem as objective, but even the questions are subjective. It depends on the ideological, political system that you're in. The kind of questions you would raise, even in the natural sciences, would be driven by that. In economics, it is even more so. So questions are subjective, answers are subjective, and yet what we are taught is as if it's an exact mathematical modeling of problems, or like math gives you answers, similarly the economics subject also should give you answers like that. Now, that is something that we are aspiring to. This is not what economics was, and definitely not in the post-World War or even pre-World War phase. It's something which happened from the 1970s. So that is something which doesn't reflect the reality at all. And third, that I would like to say on why is, after all, teachers, policymakers, all of them are deeply ideological. there is no such thing as economics being apolitical, or there is something abstract out there and, absolute truth which we are aspiring for. All of us, I am a political being, I have an ideology. The lens through which I'm looking at questions is ideological, is political. And if that is so, then you cannot have one framework. There are, as they exist, multiple frameworks. So every student who has come to learn economics has the right to be exposed to these different traditions. It is grossly unfair. And this I say both about the heterodox or the mainstream schools. If you train a young undergrad student only in a particular framework, then you're basically not giving that person a holistic vision. It's a blinkered vision, which needs to be challenged, because that also gives life to new research. About how, I would say at two levels. Number one, you need, since economics as a discipline, the curriculum, everything is top down, and not just economics, I mean, most subjects, it's the central universities, it's the departments which determine, let's say in Delhi University, it's the Delhi school which determines the curriculum for the colleges in Delhi. So number one, you would require the graduate level researchers, which means the teachers who teach in these departments, to open up their mind, to think in terms of the discipline not being in a narrow way that their own particular understanding of this has been. In fact, I would say that Keynes had said once that when my information changes, I alter my conclusions. This is something that was asked of him, that, your position is not very consistent because 2 years ago you had a different position, now you have a different position. So to this, his response was, when my information changes, I alter my conclusions. What do you do, sir? Unfortunately, in economics, we are doing the exact opposite. If the information changes and we want to cling on to our conclusions, we actually change the information. I mean, that's happening in India, for example. I mean, GDP numbers are being changed or fudged or whatever you want to call it in polite manner, just to show that there is actually growth happening in the economy. That is not how economics should be. And hence, you would require a top-down. That is one thing which you need to do for the graduate schools to open up their, horizon in terms of what economics can do. And secondly, for it to reach to the students, I think at the undergraduate level itself, you need a change in pedagogy. You need the students in colleges to know that there is not just Don Bush and Fisher. I'm just talking about macro, that you don't only have Mankiw. There are there's an entire tradition of Keynesian economics or Marxian economics, which is there, which looks at the same problems from a totally different lens and a prism. And that's something which needs to be done. Unfortunately, there is no such textbook which exposes students to both these sides, but that's something that we should aspire for. Sorry for a long answer, but yeah.
No, thank you for your answer. So, how do you think the lack of pluralism has affected policy making? What are some of the concerns and problems you can identify that you would like to highlight about inequality or the redistributive effects of the current policies?
So let me give you examples from this. I mean, maybe it'll be easier to. So let's take the case of unemployment. Now, if you ask any student of economics, what is the reason for unemployment? In all likelihood, and I'm talking not about students who have been exposed to alternative traditions, but in all likelihood, if they're just giving you a book answer, the answer would be, we have mismatching of skills, there is, the labor market is inflexible, the wages are way too high, and there is unionization, so on and so forth. So all, by and large, is essentially a labor market inflexibility which gives rise to unemployment. Whereas there is, because that's what we are taught. I mean, all of these new Keynesian models that we normally hear about on unemployment are essentially teaching you that either there's a wage rigidity or there's a price rigidity or a rigidity of both, which gives rise to unemployment in the economy. Whereas the reality is the exact opposite. If you were to take the lens of economics out and go out and check with people of why do they not have jobs, in all likelihood, it's not about them not having education. In fact, if you know, the highest unemployment in India today, according to the survey by APU, Azim Premji University, is among the PhD students. So those who have the highest degrees, who have every skill that you can think of, are the ones who are most unemployed in this country. So obviously, it's not a question of skill mismatch. It is about, and what Keynes said, it's about lack of job opportunities. So those are two opposite views on what unemployment, where it comes from. And hence, unless you know both the sides, it will be very difficult for you to make a call or take a call on this. And you would end up, implementing what the Modi government has done in terms of, making the labor market more flexible, because that's where Make in India is not happening, because our labor markets are too tight or too strict, not tight. And that is leading to unemployment. Inequality, as you raised, again, there could be two different views on inequality entirely. One is that the inequality is because you have different skills. So a higher skilled person would get higher wages, a lower skilled person gets lower wages. Now that's, very obvious. There's no doubt about that is something which gives rise to inequality. But there's something far deeper than that, which has to do with the systemic differences in inequality. I mean, those who own, let's say, these factories or these, the Ambanis and Adanis, need not necessarily have a skill mismatch. Need not necessarily only have higher skills. They have access to capital. Now, that is something which is obviously not equally accessible. If I or you were to ask the State Bank of India to let me set up a mine in Australia, I would not even be entertained. Let alone my application be accepted. So obviously there is a huge barrier to entry which exists, which gives rise to inequality, which is a more systemic explanation of inequality. There are many such instances that one could give: monetary versus fiscal policy, so on and so forth. So pluralism gives you an opportunity to open up your mind, to think of the same problem from different angles, and hence arrive at a better policy suggestions.
Thank you so much. So, based on your work, I would like to ask you about your views regarding the current policies of the current government. What are your comments about the current policies with respect to some of the problems you have identified here?
Less said, the better. If you want, on this, I can continue speaking for very, very long. But let me give you three examples. And this is something that everybody knows, but it's important to actually look at those three examples and link it with pluralism. So, the Modi 1, so 1.0, the first government, Modi government, if I were to say that if there are policy shocks, the first policy shock came with demonetization, Notbandi. Now, in hindsight, or even, if those who are trained in economics would have said it before it happened, that it was, ill-informed. Ill-informed is a very polite phrase I'm using for what they did. But demonetization is something which had no rationale. No economic rationale whatsoever. Yet that shock was given to the economy, which paralyzed the informal economy. Not just then. The ripples of that is being felt even now. And what did we achieve with that? Nothing, absolutely nothing. All the claims that were made about, confiscating black income and black economy, so on and so forth. People don't deal in cash. Big, let's say, fishes of the black economy, they don't deal in cash. They deal in multiple financial instruments. They deal with other alternatives of stashing their money abroad, their wealth abroad. And the impression was given as if the money that we hold is either black or white. It's not the money that we hold which is black or white. What doesn't come into the tax network is what the same money becomes black, and that could be in cash. In all likelihood, it will not be in cash. It will be in other forms as well. There are many, and none of that could be controlled by demonetization. And yet it was implemented because of a faulty understanding of economics. I don't know who advised him to do it, but it was done. Again, at the, midnight is something that they really like. So these things happen like at the instance of when the supreme leader thinks it should be done, just as it happened during the lockdown. The second example is the GST. Now, many issues around the GST. One, it is extremely undemocratic. The state governments were not involved at all. This decision was taken unilaterally. It has had a direct effect on the federal structure. States do not have control over taxation, but they have to deliver on multiple fronts which come under state subject. What do? And in this particular case, as you know, the taxes which have been collected, the central government owes money to the state governments, but it's not paying up. And in which case, obviously, the state governments are extremely constrained. So you had that policy, which was undemocratic. The third, which is the most recent, is the lockdown. Now, obviously, there was logic for lockdown in terms of controlling the pandemic. But as you know, it has been completely ineffective because it was more a show than in reality trying to control COVID. I mean, the number of cases that we have crossed or the number of deaths that have taken place, if we had planned it much better without inflicting the kind of economic hardship that we have, we would have achieved much better. So these three shocks essentially, let's say, epitomizes this government or these leaders in particular. And look at their response. Now, having given these shocks, which has had an effect on the incomes of the people. It has made people jobless for long periods of time. So what was a supply shock has become a prolonged demand problem. And what is the response that the government gives? Is a supply side policy response, credit infusion, labor market flexibility. So totally at odds with the problem that they're trying to solve. So yeah, I mean, in short, this is what I would say the essence of this government is. As I said, I can go on and on, but I don't want to.
We would love to hear it if you have anything else to say.
On this?
Yes.
Many things. So for example, more examples if we can give. Think of the issue of health, because obviously that's the most, the current issue which is under discussion, public health. Now, look at the ways in which, I'm not an expert on public health, but this much one can easily understand that there are broadly two models, let's say, of how you address public health. One is the model of public provisioning. So basically, the state takes the responsibility to deliver health services to the population. I mean, poor and rich alike. Something like you have in the Scandinavian countries or in England or in Europe in particular. The other is that the state does not take responsibility for any of it. It basically puts it on the private sector, and which through the medical insurance essentially caters to public health. And the government off and on can inject money through the insurance companies into this scheme. So the government's role is limited only in an insurance-driven kind of a health strategy. Now, these two models have had very opposite effects in terms of dealing with health crises, pandemics across. I'm not saying that public provisioning has necessarily resulted in better results, but it is true that access to health, access to hospitals are far better for the poor and the deprived compared to an insurance-based system. So, you know, if you talk about the United States, with the Obamacare being repealed during Trump's tenure, you essentially withdrew that basic thing itself. I mean, even though that's not the best solution, but even the insurance thing you withdrew from the poorer sections of the population. What are we doing? We are having seen that a model which has failed, we are basically implementing it in India. I mean, Ayushman is nothing else but moving away from a public provisioning of health to an insurance-based health system, and which is going to be a disaster, which already is a disaster, uh, because the government does not want to take responsibility on health, of public health. There are other issues one can discuss, for example, but that's not true only about this government. That's something which had been set in by the RBI, where the entire obsession was on inflation targeting. And I don't blame this particular RBI governor. This is something which started in particular with Raghuram Rajan. If you want me to elaborate on that, we can discuss inflation targeting. But as I said, I mean, there would be then multiple things that open up from there.
Thank you so much. So, who are some of the academicians, philosophers who you really appreciate? Someone who you would recommend us to read, the audience, because there are a lot of economic
That
students
could be a
here.
long list, but let me just say the classics. I mean, things which you should definitely read, or at least when we were graduate students, we read. And that changes the perspective on how you look at economics. Some of the authors, and I'll also try and tell you what books you can look at. And this is not this is not about macro alone. Broadly, it's macro, but not necessarily only macro. So the people you should, or who have influenced my thought, one person is Joan Robinson. I would definitely recommend, she has written many books, but one book in particular, short, small book, it's called Economic Heresies, where she's contesting the mainstream arguments, breaking them down and telling you why they are wrong. And I think it's a brilliant book because even though it was written way back I don't know when was it published, but somewhere in the 40s or 50s. And she is not only anticipating what is there in mainstream, because after all, mainstream, the broad conclusions have remained more or less the same, even though the techniques may have changed. So she's trying to contest those. And there are many other books that she's written, but this is one book I would recommend. Then I would say Rosa Luxemburg, who wrote extensively on imperialism, one of the leading authors on imperialism, and her book, The Accumulation of Capital, which I would say is difficult to read, but it's a classic text. If you can, please do read it. If you can't manage that, at least read the introduction of that book. The introduction was by Joan Robinson, but I would say I would recommend the book as well. Then the classic on macro, The General Theory, by Keynes. It's a fantastic book, but extremely difficult. But slowly try and read that. This is one book which I make all the students read during their macro course in JNU. People think that it's a classic alone. It's not. It actually talks about the problems that we are faced with even today. In fact, Keynes is far more relevant today than he ever was. Then there's his contemporary, Kaliski, who's, there is selected essays on the dynamics of the capitalist economy. That's one which has a collected volume. He's also written on socialist and mixed economy, which is relevant for a country like India. And one article in particular, which actually changed me completely. I mean, when I had come as a student, obviously I had no clue about heterodox economics, although I knew about CESP, and the big names, but we were not trained. I came from Delhi University, a college in Delhi University. So obviously I had no exposure to heterodox economics at all. And then we were made to read this one article, which really changed my perspective on economics. It was by Kaliski, Political Aspects of Full Employment. This is something which you can easily find on Google. I would recommend. should I give you more? So Baran and Sweezy are classic texts on monopoly capital. Of course, Marx, but very difficult to read. If you find him very difficult to read, at least read Sweezy's The Theory of Capitalist Development. I'm giving you basically names of classics. I mean, there are many, many more books, obviously, which you may find interesting. Closer Home, these are all international authors. It doesn't mean that we don't have internet. We have far better grounded intellectuals. I was just giving you, I divided it like that. Closer Home, I would recommend you to read the Patnaiks, Professor Prabhat Patnaik and Utsa Patnaik, Krishna Bharadwaj, her work on agriculture, Amit Bhaduri, Ashok Mitra. They have written extensively on heterodox economics, not by taking the heterodox framework from outside, but actually to generate a heterodox response sitting in India from an Indian perspective. So I would recommend them. If you're looking for popular reads, I would recommend for economic philosophy, Robert Heilbronner. He wrote an interesting book he used to teach in New School, The Worldly Philosophers. That's a good book which will give you a perspective on the big thinkers. It has Adam Smith. It's basically divided in chapters, each associated with one big thinker. Duncan Foley's book on Adam's fallacy is one which I would say. And in terms of online reading, popular read, I would say Network Ideas is a good place to go to, which gives you a lot of ideas on India. And last, which is what I'm reading currently, since I'm trying to shift my research from macro to climate change, the books which I'm enjoying really reading. One is by Rachel Carson. This is a classic again. It's supposed to be the capital of 20th century. I mean, the influence that capital had is the influence this had on climate change. It's called The Silent Spring. Then George Monbiot's Heat, that's another book, and Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything. So these three books I'm kind of reading not simultaneously, but one after the other. Yeah, that's a long list, sorry, but you asked for it.
Thank you for this amazing list. So we'll now move on to the Q&A session. The first question is from Akshit Arora. So he's asking, isn't it in the interest of the ruling classes that students didn't study about the concepts of the reserve army of labor? How can we overcome the influence of the ruling class over academia?
So this is why I asked you to read the political aspects of full employment. Absolutely. I mean, they would not want you to, let me also open the chat box. Just give me a second so that I can go back to. Yeah. So the point is, ruling classes may not want you to read all this. But the point is, thankfully, we have universities still, which are public universities, where the curriculum, the teachers, the pedagogy is still, thankfully, not determined by the market necessarily. Now, if it is not determined by the market and we have the freedom, for example, the economics that I teach, I'm not driven by what needs to be taught in terms of what makes it job worthy in a particular sector. I am teaching economics, which I think is how it should be taught. I have that freedom because my job is not dependent on having to toe the line. That's how an educational institution should be, and which is a space where you can actually be, just as you asked this question of ruling classes, let's say that you were never trained in this terminology itself, you would not have asked this question, right? So ruling classes would not want you to go in that direction, but then institutions also have their own freedom and autonomy, which they can use if I may say, also to train people against the ruling classes or against what the ruling classes would want if it's unfair and if it's wrong. So that's all actually education is about ultimately.
So Harshita is asking, how do you think privatization will affect the Indian economy?
How would privatization affect the Indian economy? It has already affected us to a large extent. I can give you many examples of that. Let's look at to the telecom sector, just as one example. Uh, Now, if you look at BSNL or MTNL, these were institutions. I mean, they still are. They have not gone away, but uh, they were profitable. They had huge network. BSNL would reach the furthest of the villages used to. Uh, Effectively, what the government has done, and I don't blame this government for this alone, the previous government as well, because they are all ideologically quite similar as far as their economics goes. As Arun Shori perhaps had said that BJP is nothing else but Congress plus cow. So in terms of its economic policy, they are pretty much the same. So the telecom sector, with the introduction of these private players, you've essentially deliberately underplayed the public sector units such as the BSNL and the MTNL, and I mean, dug them to the ground, actively doing it in terms of neglecting them, ignoring them, or whatever, giving their markets away to. Same thing happened with the discoms. Uh, a worse, I would say, is the health. Now it is called the industry. I mean, look at the exorbitant costs that you have to pay for medical treatment today. Very few people would get quality treatment who have money. Most of the people, the system is actually rigged against them. I mean, you are made to do a lot of X-rays, so on and so forth. So privatization is basically handing over of public assets over to the private corporate interest, which is essentially what we own publicly, is being put in the hands of a very few. Obviously, it also kills competition. I mean, I don't mind there being, obviously there is a corporate sector. Let them compete against the public sector, like the banks are competing. I mean, let there be a level playing ground there. Why do you need to convert? Why do you need to sell the public sector units to the private corporate interests? Other than the fact that you want to serve the interests of these corporate sectors.
So the next question is from Khushbu. She's asking, how do you think the protectionist trade policies of this government are going to impact the employment scenario and income inequality in the country?
First of all, I'm not very sure that this government is any protectionist. I mean, they are protectionist in some sense, but in some senses, they are not. Protectionism is something which would require you to create trade barriers. We are moving more and more away, because to comply with the WTO rules, to not just comply with them, but also to make the powers that be happier, you are actually opening up the economy. You're opening up the economy in terms of capital account. You're opening up the economy by allowing FDI in defense. So protectionist policies one would discuss if they're actually protectionist. I mean, it's more, it's more a smokescreen, I would say, rather than in any genuine sense protectionist for. So I would not call, these are all stances that the government takes to show to the people politically that we are trying to be pro-India, make in India, so on and so forth. But if you look at the details of it, it's not really in any sense protectionist. I mean, in some instances, they may have created trade barrier against China because, you have to kind of respond to the aggression by the Chinese on the borders. But, beyond that symbolism, there's not really much substance to that.
What do you want to comment on the farm bills of that and the farmer protests that are going on?
So, what are the protests about? I mean, most of you would have already read a lot. The government is saying that we need to remove the middlemen. They are the ones who are taking the highest chunk of, let's say, if you directly have the farmers, if the farmers have the access directly to the markets, to the consumer, then they would get better profits. But that's, again, what they are not saying is you're basically replacing the middlemen with big corporates. If let's say Monsanto were to give you seeds and they were the only players giving you seeds and the buyer is Reliance Fresh, then you're getting squeezed on both the sides. On the one hand, you have no control over costs. The cost could be higher. You have to pay up. So what is called monopsony, or rather in this case, monopoly. And the other is that you can only sell to Reliance. You don't have an option because there are, or let's say there are 3-4 big players and they determine your prices, the prices you would pay. So you're getting squeezed on both the ends. Your incomes, your prices get restricted because the corporates decide that. And on the other hand, corporates from the cost side are going to increase your costs. So your margins actually get squeezed. So this is a misnomer when they say that middlemen would get removed, so on and so forth. In fact, you will actually get henchmen as the middlemen rather than, those, small players, which gets linked to the MSP. Currently the government has a responsibility, even though it is not a price at which everybody sells. Obviously, people sell at a price low, but in many instances, MSP, in some cases, it is the price at which, so wheat and rice are two food grains where MSP actually is effective, which sets a floor level to these prices. So even if the Ambani or the Reliance Fresh wants to buy, wheat or rice from you, it could not have quoted a price lower than that because the MSP would have set the floor there. Now, that is something, even though it doesn't talk about the MSP, the laws, it is moving in the direction of a withdrawal of the government from this whole thing, and hence the response of, and I would say, a fantastic struggle by them to fight for their rights. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was a very insightful view for us. So the next question is from Eliza. So uh, she is asking, as an economic student, how would you suggest we can overcome the efficiency and perfection biases of mainstream economics in our own learning and analysis? More than identifying the problem, it is difficult to rise over an indoctrination once it has formed. How did you get over your DU training?
Okay, I'll tell you a story. So when we came to JNU, we entered the first class we had gone to, and we were taught by Amit Bhaduri, the macro course. I'm sure you've heard his name. So when we entered the class, the first thing he said was, so all that you've done in your macro, in your college, wherever, so people were from Calcutta, Presidency, Xavier's, all the big colleges, Stephens, SRCC, and everywhere else, and different places, Chennai and Bangalore, Bombay. And he said, whatever you have done in macro, throw out of the window. Let's start afresh. We are starting from scratch. And we were very angry. that we spent 3 years doing all this, and here is this guy, old man, telling us, no, all of that was useless. Throw it out of the window. We are going to start from scratch. It was, I think, the best advice ever given, because then he started building macroeconomics from scratch for us. So it was very difficult. In fact, if you read the reason why I recommended Keynes, because Keynes writes beautifully that if you're trained in something, exactly the point that you're making, it's like a cobweb. In your mind, it sits somewhere. It's very difficult for you to come out of that. It's like a spider stuck there. And hence, he says that there are many instances in my writing where you would find that fog or that cobweb showing up, where I'm actually not arguing the correct thing. But since I've been trained in a particular way, those arguments keep coming in. If it took so much time for a person like Keynes to overcome the training, obviously it requires far more, rigorous a training for us to overcome it. It is an uphill task, and hence that's why I was saying the training should start at the undergraduate level itself, which requires the curriculum to change, to be altered at different at that level itself. When the students are getting introduced to economics in the first instance, and that needs to be changed. The point that I was making earlier. If you don't do that, it becomes very difficult. But then we are there. I mean, some of us are still there teaching and trying to change the views, or at least not change the views, but to expose students to alternative views of things.
Thank you. So the next question is from Samriddhi. She is asking, in what ways macroeconomics needs to be changed, especially considering that we are in a low interest rate era? What do you think of MMT?
That is an interesting point. MMT will take another session. But let me discuss this interest rate bit and also link it with MMT. So the problem with the interest rate policy, something which I couldn't discuss earlier, was that you're basically obsessed with monetary policy. So when it comes to inflation, you're talking about increasing the interest rate because that controls demand, and that's the assumption. Again, it's wrong, but I'm just telling you the way macroeconomic policy making is being done. And when you want to steer the economy, you want to bring the interest rates down. So you're essentially trying to maneuver the economy entirely through monetary policy. The exact opposite of what Keynes Kalinske had argued, that monetary policy actually is very ineffective when it comes to recessions. You would require fiscal policy as an active, component of policy making. But unfortunately, we have given up on that tradition of economics entirely. In fact, fiscal policy is a strict no-no. I mean, it's a red flag. I mean, you just cannot have fiscal policy driven discussions, except in very extreme recessions as of today. About the MMT, they have got the basic point right. After all, it is in the heterodox framework. So they are saying that you have control over your monetary policy. And since you have a control over your monetary policy, you can actually have an expansionary fiscal policy without worrying about inflation or without worrying about other problems that come with fiscal policy, all that crowding out, so on and so forth. But I think there is one serious limitation of MMT, is that it's perhaps too simplistic, because it essentially is looking at the policy from the prism of a first world who do not have any external foreign exchange constraints, so on and so forth. Obviously, countries like India do not have a freedom of or a fiscal space where they can keep on spending without having to worry about the external constraint or other problems that come with it. So yes, they have their they've got, what should I say? I mean, their heart is in the right place, but their mind is perhaps a little too simplified, a little too simplified as a story, as a broad frame. But as I said, I'm not against them. I'm merely saying that the real world is far more nuanced than that.
Thank you so much for your answer. The next question is from Vinayak Sanjeev. So he has two questions. He is asking, to what extent trust, which is an essential thing for economic development, lacking in India? And the second question is, why is India slipping down the Human Development Index, and why is it not emphasized with importance in the society?
So the first question, I'm not clear. Trust between who? I didn't quite get that. When you say trust. Trust
Vinayak, would you
between who?
like to unmute and explain the question? I don't think he's here, so we can move on to the next question he has.
About the Human Development Index, I mean, since the first question is not clear, about the HDI, it's slipping down because we are not worried about, I mean, we are only obsessed with growth. We are not looking at the overall, which Amartya Sen had said, that you can have high growth, but you may not have good life necessarily. So if our focus is entirely on growth and GDP numbers, and we are not thinking about education, about health, about other social indicators, then obviously you would be slipping down the ladder, the index.
Thank you.
So, I would like to explain my question. I had recently listened to one of the speeches made by Kaushik Basu, where he was saying that trust is the oil for economic growth, uh, India post-COVID. Um, so there, trust was mentioned. Again, I saw in a lecture about comparing heterodox and mainstream economics there, in measuring development in an heterodox framework, trust was again taken into consideration. I I'm I'm not in a position to define trust, as I don't know much about that, but like I would like to know if from an Indian context how much that I do not know how trust is measured, but like how it is effective in an Indian context, how it is quantified in an Indian context.
See, generally, when it comes to trust, it's basically the trust normally, and the context that you're giving, it's obvious that there's actually a trust between the corporate sector and the government. And that's not a trust that I'm bothered by. In fact, I'm not interested in that trust at all. Whether the corporate sector has trust in the government or not, some of them actually are more than the required trust in the government, those who are close to the government. But I would put this question differently. I mean, why should the common citizen be worried about the trust between the corporate sector and the government? The trust that is important or relevant for people who are worried about the well-being is the trust that people have in the government. And that is totally different from the trust that perhaps, I'm not sure, I haven't heard that, but the trust that perhaps Professor Basu would be referring to, which is in all likelihood the business leaders. I mean, the Bajajes, the Ambanis, and that they don't have the confidence currently to make the investment, so on and so forth. Yes, that is important. The government should provide, business incentives, so on and so forth. But I would say that the government's job is not merely that. It's much more than that. I mean, government's job is to improve the living conditions of the people of this country. They are the ones who have elected them, so their primary responsibility is towards them. If they are breaking the trust of the corporate sector, I won't be as bothered. They shouldn't break the trust of the people of this country.
Thank you very much for your answer. We have one last question. So, just a minute, I'll just can't find the question. Sorry, it's just... Yeah. There's another question from Dhananjay. So he's asking how a person is supposed to know his or her perspective is right when all questions are seen as cynicism according to mainstream narratives. If we can see everything as subjective, how can we reach into some kind of conclusion at a short period of time?
Okay, so when I said subjective, there are certain things. So let's say there's a logic to a certain thing, and that logic, the unemployment issue that I discussed. So there are two different views on unemployment. Which of the two views is correct is something that you can check, or you can find by statistical analysis, by looking at data. So it's not as if that this question itself is totally, or the answers are totally in the abstract. The example that I just gave to you about, let's say, and in this context, that those who have the highest degrees have the highest unemployment in this country, and the lowest unemployment is with the unskilled labor. So obviously, the skill mismatch theory doesn't sit well with the reality, with the facts that we have. And yet what we teach in the classrooms would be skill mismatch, would be rigidity. So similarly about the real wages, there is downward flexibility. In fact, in the organized sector, the wage shares have been falling consistently for the last 20, 30 years now. Now, if that is happening, then there is no, rigidity means that it's not falling, but reality tells you that it is falling. So obviously then, even though you may have been trained in a particular way, if you look at data, you start questioning that. And that's something which doesn't require ideology. I mean, it just requires you to open your mind and to look at data and then come to your own conclusions, having been trained in different traditions. So I would say, given the training is in a particular manner or tradition, it becomes very difficult for you to even be questioning it. I mean, you look at facts as facts in that case, and you don't really go or do research on the data that you see. You just try to fit the data into the framework that you have. As the quote I gave from Keynes, that if things change, if data changes, I change my conclusions, I change my theory. So there is a two-way relationship between data and theory. That's the correct way of doing economics.
Thank you. So we have one last question. That is, do you think there has been an air of political marketing in India in the recent years that even the educated Indians are hopping on the bandwagon without establishing accountability of the posture?
So hopping onto the bandwagon of what? I didn't, sorry, I probably didn't hear you.
I think the bandwagon of about the political marketing. Amrita, do you want to unmute yourself and explain the question? I think she's speaking about the political marketing and how it's influencing the people, and people are falling prey to whatever marketing is going on.
So you mean to say political marketing by the current government about themselves, I guess.
Yes, I think the question is about that.
Yeah, so I mean, 2-3 things. Number one, if you yourself are a party to let's say, if you are getting something out of this whole system, then it is in your interest for the system to remain the same. I mean, the middle classes, only when they start losing something that they start questioning the government. The same system may have been unfair to begin with, but they don't. So when it comes to them, they start questioning the government. So far, the economic impact of the mistakes, or not just mistakes, but the bad policy that this government has made, has not really fallen so much. It is increasingly falling now, has not fallen so much on the upper middle class, on the business sector. It has actually fallen on the poor, the medium business enterprises. I mean, so the small business players. Now, if you ask them, they would not be very gung-ho about this government necessarily. At the same time, and I agree that they would not be anti-government either. And that's where I think the divisive agenda of this political party, of this government, comes in. That people are willing to undermine their economic conditions to fulfill their political ambitions in terms of, India being a supreme, whatever, leading nation in the world, India being a Hindu nation, the glorious past that we had, the so-called glorious past that we had. So that aspirational thing, combined with the hatred towards other communities, is something that the marketing is doing quite well. And deep down, people are communal. I mean, that's something that I've understood from whatever little politics I know, that a lot of Indians are soft communal in their approach. It could be soft casteist, soft communal. If you put it all together, then you know what a deadly combination would that be. So the electorate then responds with those crass, identities that they have in different instances.
Thank you for your wonderful insights and for answering all our questions. It was a beautiful session, and we are now coming to a close. So, one last question I have is, where do you see hope in this country?
That is okay. So I don't see any hope, at least currently, in the political opposition, the political parties. I don't see any hope in, let's say, Rahul Gandhi or the left, or any of these regional parties either. I don't see hope there at all. What I see hope in, because if there was hope, they would have acted by now. Where I see hope is actually in people who are raising their voice against the excesses that the government is making. It started with the students. It went on to common citizens, the minorities who are themselves directly affected by this government's policies, whether it is the Shaheen Bagh protest or the protest on NRC against NRC across the country, and now the farmers. So I'm saying the constituencies which have themselves got directly affected are the ones who are on the roads, and that's the hope that I see. Collectively, this number is going to be bigger than the number which is in support of the government, and that's the hope I have.
Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation today and for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us today. Thank you, audience, for being here. We look forward to have you for more of such conversations, and have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Trisha.
Thank you.
And everybody else at Rethinking Economics India.
Thank you. This was the last event of the year. Please stay in touch, and see you next year. Thank you. All the members of Rethinking Economics, we have another meeting after this, so please join. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining.
All right. Okay.